It is the 16th of March, 2021. The other day, there was a conversation I was involved in about nuclear parity. The idea, or the question that started the conversation was, um, is China likely to achieve nuclear parity with the United States soon? And if so, what does that mean? The idea of nuclear parity is there's a few different ways to actually look at the question, but basically, the way that what most people mean when they say nuclear parity is they mean, do both countries have uh, an equivalent number of similar grade nuclear weapons? So if the U.S. has 200 uh, city-killing warheads, does China have 200 city-killing warheads? Um, there's a lot of detail that goes into that, though, to the point that just counting the number of nuclear warheads doesn't really make sense. If you give just a flat count, if you compare tactical nuclear warheads, which are not city busters, they're things you would use in an infantry fight. They're like artillery shell sized nuclear weapons that are very low yield, way, way, way below the yield of like a Hiroshima bomb. Um, they're like super artillery. They're huge compared to artillery, but they are not really. I think a Moab has a larger yield. Uh, some of our conventional uh, weapons have a larger yield than some tactical nukes do. So these are not the ones that like screw up the world and mess everything up and everybody dies because of them. So you obviously wouldn't count those because we're not including in the nuclear parity count how many Moabs each different country has. The so that measure is silly. On the other hand, delivery systems count too, in terms of if you're going to compare if two nations are on nuclear parity or not. A country that has 1,000 city busting warheads but no delivery system doesn't really have anything, right? They're not really a threat to anybody except for themselves mostly. Or if they were to sell them to, rogue states or rogue actors or crazy, terrorist groups or end of the world type people, um, then that would be bad. But they don't have delivery systems. If you don't have a delivery system, then you don't have a weapon. If you have a weapon, well, just having a device doesn't mean you have a weapon. You have to make it robust to delivery. Rocket launches are traumatic. If you have a delicate nuclear device, it's going to fall apart. So weaponizing a nuclear explosive is quite hard. Uh, Making a robust device, usually you have to add mass to make something robust. Miniaturizing a robust device is hard. Then delivery systems becomes another hard thing. So China is an interesting example of this, where they have most Chinese rocketry is based on hypergolic fuels, which is that's where you have two liquid propellants that are the moment they don't need an igniter. As soon as they touch, they just ignite. Most Chinese rocketry is based on hypergolic fuels. Now, hypergolic fuels in the West, they're terribly toxic. They're horrible to store. They're very, very caustic. It's some of the nastiest hazmat stuff in existence. Hypergolic fuel, because they're so reactive. Um, Hypergolic fuels in the West, we typically think of that as the type of fuel that you would use in space when you need to use a rocket engine over and over and over, like as a thruster. Uh, you get into space, you need to change orientation or speed up or slow down or whatever, and you don't have igniters to light the engine over and over. So just as soon as the two components come into contact in the engine bell, or the combustion chamber, they ignite right away. So you don't need an igniter for something like that. So hypergolic fuels are very useful in space. They're very nasty to deal with on Earth because they're so utterly toxic and caustic and disgusting, expensive to store, highly volatile. You have to check on them all the time. Uh, Chinese space rockets. Now, I'm going to talk about space rockets a little bit, but these apply to ICBMs directly because ICBM technology is rocketry, space rockets, satellite technology, and satellite technology is ballistic missile technology. So, um, there that's why this issue is so tightly related, and every country's different space program tells you a lot about their ballistic missile program also. So, in the West, um, space rockets for satellite launch, we don't typically use hypergolic fuels for, especially for main boosters, because that's so much volume of propellant required, and if it's hypergolic, it's really gross, and you could have these accidents, just horrifying accidents can occur. Um, China's space launch vehicles are almost exclusively hypergolic propellants. Uh, so this is not the same as just saying, oh, well, they use liquid propellants. Liquid propellants have their own complications compared to solid rocket propellants, but when you start talking about hypergolic rocket propellant, that's a huge issue, because that means that everything involved with hypergolics is complicated and hard and dangerous and disgusting and scary and caustic. Compare that to like liquid methane. That's a fairly safe. That's a pretty safe propellant. Uh, rocket propellant, the RP1 or whatever. Um, that's kerosene. All those are in the same, very stable. It's hard to even light them with a match. It's hard to accidentally ignite them type stuff. Liquid oxygen, obviously, also very stable. It's just you have to keep it cold enough to stay liquid. Uh, Same thing with the methane. You just have to keep it really cold. Hypergolics, whole different storage problem. Uh, and the Chinese use hypergolics for their main boosters, which is insane. That's so kind of, I wouldn't say environmentally unfriendly. It's not just that. It's dangerous to do, but the Chinese just don't care. They make massive amounts of hypergolic fuels. They use huge amounts of hypergolic fuels, and their boosters fall back down on their own villages in China and like through people's houses, and there's just this toxic stuff everywhere. And the villagers have no idea. They're like playing in it, and it's crazy. But that's communist environmental control for you. Uh, I mean the Soviets. If you go back to the Soviet era, they were pumping nuclear waste into groundwater wells to get rid of it. So um, the communists really don't have a very good track record with safety stuff and well, Chernobyl and environmentalism. So anyway, or environmental protections. Um, so nuclear parity, we have delivery vehicles that have liquid propellants. They cannot remain fueled. If you're using hypergolic propellants, hypergolic fuels will eventually corrode and eat through the rocket. They're not stable enough to keep a rocket fueled. If you are using cryogenic propellants, even if you do have a stable, like a room temperature stable propellant like kerosene or RP1, the oxidizer is liquid oxygen. That has to be cool, like super cold. Keeping an entire rocket refrigerated like that doesn't, that's hard to do for a long time. And there's constant evaporation problems and replenishment and so on. So the bottom line is, if you have a liquid propellant rocketry program, it's all based on liquid propellants. You do not have fueled rockets that are on the ready all the time. That means you do not have second strike capability. You have first strike capability, but you don't really have second strike capability unless you can be sure that both the rockets are going to survive, the launch sites are going to survive, the fuel tank infrastructure and piping and all that stuff has to survive a nuclear first strike, and you have to have enough time to get your rockets out into launch position, fuel them, and then launch a second strike. And fueling up rockets takes more than a couple of minutes. That's bad because intercontinental ballistic flight only takes a few minutes also. So to say that China would have nuclear parity with the United States, okay, we can discuss it, but the way people are discussing it is silly. They're talking about how many bombs do they have versus how many bombs do they have. When we talk about second strike capability, because that's the important thing when you're looking at nuclear balance, the MAD doctrine, MAD, mutual assured destruction, meaning that I'm not going to fight you because if I fight you, I'm not going to fight you all out. I'm not going to nuclear strike you because the counter strike would be so devastating that it would screw both of us up and there's no benefit. Nobody wins. So you can guarantee that the contest will not occur because the only outcome is universal loss. And it wouldn't just be a loss for us, be a loss for, everybody would be on the losing end of that. It wouldn't end humanity. It's not quite, that's not the typical scenario. That's the very, very edge extreme case. But you could genuinely destroy nations, at least for a generation. So nuclear parity has a lot more to do with delivery systems and the actual technology of the, it was still delivery systems, how to get the warhead. Each ICBM, you launch one missile and you have 7 warheads in there, and they all become independently targeted. Um, that's also more advancement in delivery vehicles. Uh, Defense, missile defense, evasion systems, uh, first X-ray strike, the EMP strikes, in concert with a second wave coming in, disrupt, blind the enemy, and then send a strike in or whatever, or just disrupt the enemy and leave it at that. The enemy, on the other hand, has no idea what your rocket's doing, so they might think it's a real first strike, an actual blow up cities first strike, instead of an EMP strike or an X-ray strike or whatever. So, how the retaliate, what's the appropriate level of response is not easy to discern. So the doctrine becomes mutual assured destruction to make sure that the other side doesn't try to first strike you. Now, I haven't done a video on this yet, but there's a very important idea that traces back to violence. If you've seen the Violence is the Foundation of Negotiation video, destruction is swift and cheap. Creation of capacity, or creation of anything, is slow and costly. So mutual assured destruction works because you're guaranteeing that both sides are going to get that cheap, swift destruction, and that nobody's going to be able to build their way out of a first strike or second strike. The way that the United States and the Soviet Union took their doctrine was to focus on the second strike capability. So the Soviets worked very hard on solid rocket boosters, and the Americans also worked very hard on solid rocket boosters, to the point that both of them have eventually developed ballistic missile submarines. So those submarines could be anywhere, the quietest submarines that have ever been made. Their job is to sit there like holes in the water and wait for orders that a retaliatory strike was necessary. In the movies, you often see that they're doing the first strike. That's possible, but not really what the original doctrine was focused on. The original nuclear doctrine was that land-based missiles were the first strike, and with the first strike capability, and the second strike capability were the submarines, generally speaking. Oh, and not only talk about missiles here. There's also, of course, aircraft. Lots of aircraft delivery systems as well, in addition to naval cruise missiles and things like that. But kind of the ultimate ace in the hole was to have ballistic missile submarines. To have a ballistic missile submarine, you obviously cannot have liquid-fueled rockets to do that with. You also have to develop, very high-speed underwater missile technology, or you have to surface your submarines, which is very risky because at that moment they're maximally vulnerable, and you don't want the submarines to be super far away from the target. You want a submarine strike to be launching from, better proximity than going all the way across. You have the U.S. and Russia. If you look at the Earth, you turn it, you're looking for the North Pole down. The United States and Russia are on opposite sides of each other. The missiles aren't going like this, right? They're not going across the Pacific and across the Atlantic. That's just if you look at Mercator projections. If you look at a globe and take a piece of string and find the shortest route between cities, most of these things are going to go across the Arctic. And that's why the B-52 bomber routes are usually Arctic routes. Same thing with ballistic missile submarines. But a lot of those are going to be along the coastlines, well, somewhat close to the coastlines of potential aggressor nations. And that's to shorten the flight time to get to wherever they are. So land-based missiles only takes a few minutes to get to the target. They're not far away. In the Soviet case, they're still not very far away. In the Chinese case, the ballistic missile submarines, they are in proximity to the enemy. The Chinese don't have the capability yet. They don't have the capacity to build ballistic missile submarines that would give them the same second strike capability the United States has. They also have another difficulty, that their hypergolic propellant program um, works pretty well, but it means that most of their missiles have to be mobile. They can't build hardened silos the way that the United States did because we'll find them, and that'll be our first targets. Their hypergolic propellant depots are also hard targets. So they've had to go to a huge amount of effort to try to even have a missile capability. So they've gone through kind of phases of rotating a couple of missiles that are fueled up and then detank and then switch to different ones and so on. So always having some capacity online at a given moment. So the Chinese deterrent just qualitatively is not that great. But it's getting up to the level of the United States, and at some point it will be up to the level of the United States. And further, it's not possible to, even though the Chinese program is nowhere near where the Russian program was, the Soviet program was, it's not safe to launch a nuclear strike on China, even for the U.S. There's no scenario where an American nuclear strike on China would pan out. Everybody has something to lose. And the internationalization of trade guarantees that there's a lot of levels at which we would lose. It's not just that the Chinese would strike back. We'd be losing, be cutting off your nose to spite your face, so to speak. This is not, there's no situation where that turns out to be a good thing. So, nuclear parity is not necessary for China to have an effective nuclear deterrent. It's already a deterrent. We don't have to worry about that. They are going to improve that deterrent, and we will probably not see actual parity, but we'll see something close enough that it doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't matter if you can blow up the world 10 times or 30 times. Once you get up to blowing up the world 5 times or so, I think, it's kind of a wash. You don't need to be able to blow it up more than that. And nuclear weapons are costly to maintain. They also become an internal security risk because maintaining nuclear weapons also means securing nuclear weapons. Securing nuclear weapons means that you're contributing a significant amount of your own capacity just to maintaining that and securing that against your own internal bad actors. And especially in the Chinese case, it may become this bad in the U.S., but especially right now in the Chinese case with a highly authoritarian centralized command structure, but factions breaking apart within that structure even more quickly than is evident from an outside perspective. China's not as monolithic as the CCP hopes to portray. And the biggest economic bubble in human history being focused there in their own real estate market, and they know it. There is a clock ticking. It's just nobody knows when it's going to go off. It's kind of like it's like the decaying matter that's put in the box with Schrodinger's cat. It's going to decay at some point, but nobody knows what the half-life is. So it's a random event. At some point, a black swan is going to occur, and it's going to scare the Chinese public, or it's going to scare whoever is invested in Chinese real estate, and the real estate market's going to melt down there. That's going to have a unbelievable cascade effect to the point that we could see civil strife within China on a scale that we're really not expecting it, because people have gotten used to having food, which is unusual in communist countries, because China's not really communist anymore. They've become effectively, they have a fascist economy. They don't, there's private ownership of the means of production, privately owned. The state does not dictate all production. There are not production quotas outside of state industries. All industries are owned in part by the state, but they're not always dictated or guided by the state. There's private ownership of money and things like that. So they've, on all production of any military significant category, has to be evaluated for military benefit before approved or funded or whatever. So the state champion companies, mostly owned by the state, partial private ownership, guidance from on high, all driven by military support. This is exactly Hitler's economic blueprint when prior to that Mussolini's. So China is a fascist economy right now, not a communist economy right now, which makes them prone to market pressures even though they have massive state involvement. Actually, state involvement in the economy is what's caused this problem. Fascist economics is literally a formalization of crony capitalism. And that first generation that was with Hitler, who lived through the depraved years of the Weimar Republic, they were true believers in the program. Now, horrible stuff happened in Nazi Germany, right? From a German's perspective, uh, they're looking at, are we going to go back to the 1920s and sell our kids to sex tourists and endure that level of depravity? Or is the bad stuff that's going on a price I'm willing to pay for Germany to be prosperous again, uh, adhere to its traditions, have family life and things like that, without starving in the streets with just the political elite just printing money like crazy and impoverishing the whole country. So people who lived through the depravity of the Weimar Republic, they were true believers to the level that they were willing to forego the enormous opportunities for corruption that were presented to them by fascist economics. China, however, they've already got their fat second generation that are not believers in anything. They're believers in money, but they don't have any, uh, there's no social underpinning to them to that money because a lot of them got it easy or they got it just through printing or through government largesse essentially. So um, that, you know, fascist economics is a formalization of crony capitalism. We in the West know crony capitalism is a recipe for disaster due to corruption. And China is undergoing that right now. Really, really bad. So when the bubble eventually pops, you're going to see the full effects of a total abject lack of social faith, social trust, and I don't know what's going to happen. So my point with that is when those kind of breakdowns occur, if China has too many nuclear weapons, how do you control who's got them? How do you trust the general in charge of this nuclear weapons division and also trust this general and this general? And how can you be guaranteed? How can you be sure that none of them are going to sell out, go to a different faction, or just start selling their stuff overseas and then jump ship? The way that the Soviets didn't wind up selling a whole bunch of nuclear. A couple got out, but not, it wasn't a big widespread problem. But when the Soviet Union broke down, um, God, how many people were selling assault helicopters and armored personnel carriers and tanks and stuff. So, um, the arms bonanza from the Soviet breakdown, were that to be, were a parallel to occur with a Chinese breakdown, whether or not it was a complete breakdown the way the Soviet was. Um, all you would need is large factional rifts or some the sort of general liberty movement that the Hong Kong protests have turned into, which precipitated the lockdowns over um, medical pathogen concerns. But it is a little suspicious that if you were in the opposition, then your entire family was infected suddenly and you got welded shut in your apartment. I'm just saying the timing was pretty convenient for the Chinese there. Um, anyway, were that to blow up and that movement to gain factional sponsorship by a faction that is a rival to Xi and had enough regional integrity that they could break away or attempt to break away. Having too many nuclear weapons inside China would immediately become an absolute dire threat to Beijing, as opposed to right now being a benefit to Beijing. So uh, the CCP has to think very carefully about all aspects of this, uh, which, it's similar to, we see this in designs of different things. We see it in the designs of their rockets too. It's not possible for any single person to commandeer and use a Chinese nuclear weapon. It's even harder there than it would be for the U.S. And the U.S. stuff is all designed to where it requires a whole unit to agree and actually launch. Um, if you get to the Soviet era, the Soviets were so worried about rogue factions within the Soviet Union that inside the Red Army, only officers had maps, which is insane. Like in the U.S. Army, it's impossible to imagine that you haven't briefed everybody on the plan and that your privates have all seen the map. They all know what's going on. Soviet Union, they can't delegate. They could not delegate that way, to the point that just the design of a machine gun, the M240 machine gun, and before that the M60, and before that the Mag 58. All those guns, they have disintegrating belts. The ammunition is linked before you get it. You pull it out. A single person can operate that weapon system. Now, it's better if you have an AG, but a single person can operate an American machine gun. If you look at the PKM, that is not true. It takes a huge amount of work to prep that thing to get going. And there is no concept of grabbing a resupply crate of ammo, opening it up, and just sticking it in the gun and firing. That's not how that ammo comes. Each one is individually wrapped in, each round is individually wrapped in tissue paper. 4 or 5 rounds are in a little flimsy box. Those are all packed into a gigantic, like, tuna can that you have to use one of those, there's a giant can opener that comes with the crates. There's only one can opener per crate with several different tins inside of it. It's insane. The amount of work it takes to go from pallet of ammo to shooting the weapon system is huge. And the belts don't disintegrate. You have to reload them. There's this, like, horrible... Anyway, their weapon systems were designed in such a way that it would not be possible for a small number of people to decide that they were going to commandeer the most casualty producing weapons in a unit and actually use those to do anything. In the United States military, it's totally possible because everything there is built to be easy to use. That thinking that was on the Soviet side, that's the same thinking that you need actually for a nuclear weapons system. When you're talking about small arms and tanks and stuff like that, you want to enable the privates to be able to fight as quickly as possible, as easily as possible, and focus just on their mission, just on the task at hand. With the Soviet systems, none of that can happen because they don't have any concept of an expeditionary military in the first place, nor does China, because it's not safe for them to. It's not safe for the CCP to enable their privates to do stuff on their own. In both cases, though, it's not safe ever to enable, a nuclear unit to have just one person making decisions and just push buttons and launch missiles. That's not okay ever. So, for the same reason that that's not safe for them, massive proliferation beyond a useful number, beyond a useful limit, the number necessary to present a credible second strike threat to a first strike nation, like what percentage are going to survive? Of this percentage, can we still grievously, strike back at the aggressor? Beyond whatever that number is, however you calculate it, beyond whatever that number is, having too many nuclear weapons is really bad. So nuclear parity is it's more qualitative than quantitative, and quantity becomes a risk by itself to the nation holding weapons if you go past the second strike threshold. It becomes a liability very quickly. And the more disrupted your country becomes, the greater liability it becomes. Actually, I'm very curious. I don't know the details anymore. I haven't kept up with it. But I'm actually curious to find out. I'd be curious to know what controls a country like Pakistan, which is somewhat unstable, what they've put in place for their nuclear controls. Because that's a pretty small country with no strategic depth whatsoever. And they're nuclear armed, and the level of factionality going on there is very intense, and the number of ideological contests that are, according to those ideologies, are absolute in nature, is quite high, and that's a really tricky situation. And they've got nuclear weapons. That's necessary to prevent India from completely muscling them over, but beyond just having a leave us alone capability. Holding nuclear weapons are a pretty big risk for Pakistan. The more unstable China becomes, the more of a liability their nuclear weapons are going to become to the CCP itself as well. So that's an interesting situation. Nuclear parity is not as simple of a thing as one might think, as you have heard through this. Economics, technology levels, and that gets straight into geography really quickly when you're talking about land-based systems and ocean access. Having access to the blue water, not just coastal waters. That's a prerequisite for having a ballistic missiles submarine program, and so on. So it's an interesting topic. And the reason it's interesting is because it's not simple, and for some reason, nuclear parity has been like trending in discussions about China. Uh, it's a very interesting subject, but it's not the most significant subject with regard to the American contest with China. So that's all I've got on this subject for the moment. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll try to cover whatever.